Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Chatting Change. I'm your host Charlie Ashby. Today we're going to be looking at some of our previous episodes and what our expert guests had to say on a variety of topics. Starting off this episode, we jump back into our discussion with research assistant Joe Bella and his views on disruptive technology. Well, this week we're actually talking about disruptive technology, which is a very interesting discussion topic.
Yeah, for sure. It's quite an interesting concept. The idea of disruptive, it's got negative connotations around it. If you hear of something as disruptive, you're instantly trying to shy away from it, and you don't really want anything to do with it. Which, funnily enough, is quite reflective of the wider view towards disruptive technology, because change is bad.
Yeah, it's funny. Like our show title is Chatting Change. But everyone considers change to be sort of a negative thing, when really it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, exactly. So it's more so, it's disruptive not so much as in day-to-day operations. Of course, sort of the methods through which you achieve your day-to-day will differ.
Yeah.
But it's disruptive more so in a market sense. It disrupts the current status quo. It changes what's generally accepted as good practice or as best practice. Yeah, it's something not to shy away from, really. It's all about what is the next big step we can make to improve efficiency, to improve a general sort of employee satisfaction, if it's making their lives easier. It's generally going to be quite a disruptive, so to speak, innovation. So particularly with disruptive technology, sort of disruptive innovations is more so of an umbrella term, as a catch-all for disruptive things in nature.
Okay.
But yeah, with technology, it's sort of everywhere at the minute. It's all about what is the next big thing.
Are sort of companies like hatching on to whatever, like trying to latch on to whatever's disruptive more now, or?
I suppose disruptive is more so what's on the horizon. So companies are trying to come up with the next disruptive thing. Okay. A lot of sort of tech startups that you hear about, they're all trying to shake up what is currently in practice, what's being done. So companies themselves are probably investing quite a lot into research and development around something that can disrupt their sector. As sort of counterintuitive as that sounds to say, stemming from, again, the negative connotations of disruptive. But it is, at the core of it, trying to become more efficient, trying to become more streamlined in their processes.
Can you give examples, like in recent times that someone might know?
Someone might know.
The common man.
I'm not sure if you've heard of, I believe it's Ocado.
Yes,
procurement company. So what they've done that's quite disruptive is a lot of their warehouses are just fully automated.
Oh, okay.
You'll go through, you'll see videos online where it is quite a futuristic looking thing where you've got all these robots zooming around and avoiding each other, whereas what would usually be done by, say, 40 to 50 employees picking is now hundreds of robots all running about. I think the only manual interaction people have within those sites are when it comes to packaging everything together at the end.
Yeah.
So all of the running back and forth to pick locations within the warehouse is done by robots. So what that sort of opens up with in regard to disruptive nature is it's a complete reconfiguration of how warehouses are designed and how they're organized. So obviously when you're considering robots, you don't have to adhere to what are sort of the health and safety standards for people where you can't have things over your head. You don't need sort of a certain amount of width between aisles for forklifts to fit down. So it becomes a smaller operation in just sheer terms of size. But it also becomes more efficient. You've got reduced overhead cost of the actual space you're taking up. You've got reduced overhead cost in that you're employing fewer people. And then the flip side of that is then you also are generating more sort of high worth jobs in the maintenance of the robots and sort of the progressions around streamlining that process further. So I'd say that's probably one of the more cutting edge approaches that warehouses are taking at the minute.
Yeah, it's funny, like growing up you always think about robots as sort of this futuristic thing, and it might not be specifically sort of the idea of what we imagine, like a robot butler helping you out or something, but it is happening right now, I guess.
It is, yeah, and it's sort of say throughout the 60s and 70s, as sort of now looking back on it, it's the idea of retrofuturism.
Yes.
All right, not quite. We haven't got flying cars through the streets. We haven't got anything that was expected, but it's sort of the same functionality, but it's just no one could really envisage what it would look like.
Following on from that great discussion, we look back at our first supply chain academics episode, in which our director, Liam Fassam, and Mills Hills discussed the issues regarding drones and airports.
So last night, flights to Newark were disrupted for a while after a drone was spotted, and obviously in the UK we've seen a certain amount of similar disruption.
So when you said drone was spotted, you're not talking about an academic droning on, you're talking about a physical...
Yes, this was one that was not so easily avoided, unfortunately, as those droning academics that we love to hate. So what do we do about this then? You know, airports, part of critical infrastructure you've just mentioned. A lot of cyber attacks are often very cheap to mount, with huge costs imposed on businesses and loss of opportunity costs and the rest of it. Airports are pretty much soft targets, to use a phrase we've used a couple of times today. There are some technological solutions which can be deployed to protect airports and other places. And a graduate of our MBA top-up program set up a company called Drone Defence, which is one of the leaders in that space in the UK. We'll have him on in the future podcast. But in the meantime, before the technology gets out there, and then no doubt it's going to be a total, poacher / gamekeeper battle to try and keep the drones out of planes' way. Are we just going to have to get used to disruption to your favourite form of locomotion, aircraft?
Potentially. I will say, though, I'm quite excited about this drone thing because Twitter and other social media platforms are available, of course, has been lit up for the past 3 years with experts on politics and Brexit. I'm surprised how many people there are in the country that are an expert at this. All of a sudden, since all this drone stuff, I'm amazed how many experts we have in this country about drones and what you do.
I think some of these people are multi-skilled. No, I think they're the same people.
There's about 66 million people in this country that's an expert on a drone.
They're all drone experts. They're all international trade negotiators. Awesome. They're all blockchain experts.
I am full of confidence we'll have all of them on. Anyway, so I was talking to somebody recently at the wonderful Transport Systems Catapult who is an expert in drones. That's what they do. I don't apologise my flippant nature now. I don't understand the technology that goes behind them. I can see their use and their importance.
Yes.
I can also, I'm struggling to understand why you'd want one as a toy. But
I've got several, and I've got to say they are very, very difficult to fly, unless you are aged 8, when apparently it just comes naturally to you. Okay. I don't know whether my 8-year-old is going to be a helicopter pilot or something in the future, or maybe a Predator controller, but they're massively difficult to fly, unless if you spend a 1,500 quid instead of 30 quid, they suddenly get a lot easier. Wow. But yeah, well, they are quite fun. But anyway,
links quite nicely to what this chap was saying, is that this control piece. So at the moment we have these wonderful bastions of the sky called NATS, of the National Air Traffic Control Service, who guide our aircraft in and out through the airways of the UK and do a wonderful job.
Very congested airspace,
And that involves semi-automation, and all you hear from people is, well, we've had automation aircraft for a number of years. Yes, you have, but you've had semi-automated environment, which still requires the intervention of a human being to talk to each other, to instruct the object as an aircraft to do something based on the airways. He was explaining to me, and quite interestingly, at least I thought, that's all well and good, and we've cracked the nut with air traffic control at the moment, and there are still risks and there are still incidents that happen, even with this amazing job that they do and the complexities that they have and the software that sits behind it. It's the issue they're having at the moment with any of these drones is automated air traffic control. So how do you get something that's automated to react in an instant along an airway? So if you need something that's automated to move 10 degrees to the right and head off in a different direction, they're not quite sure how you do that. And then to mix that with semi-automated air traffic control is an absolute brain ache for them at the moment. So it goes beyond the scope of trying to geo ring fence an airport and saying any drone that goes anywhere near that will simply drop out the sky. You can't do that, because if the police need to do something, then there's
and you can't just be firing stuff, whether it's electromagnetic or shotgun pellets into the air.
It just doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly.
So then the next step would be this automated air traffic control system, but we're at a loss to how that would work. I mean, we can't even, I don't want to peel it back to automated, well, it is automated vehicles, isn't it? But we can't even get a car to follow another car on a piece of tarmac without it having some sort of sensational crash and it ended up in a newspaper. Yet people seem to want us to be able to automate and do all that sort of stuff in the sky. I mean, that's a whole different level of complexity and danger, personal privacy, restricted airspace, potential of terror. There's a whole. You can go on for days and days and days talking about the risks associated with this. But there is no silver bullet answer to this.
So automation or semi-automation can help us squeeze more aircraft into the same. Obviously, there's a finite amount of sky up there. However, I'm sure that the development of this has taken into account weather and needing to reroute things according to weather change. But as soon as you mess things up by sort of saying, okay, there's no movements at, let's choose an airport at random, Gatwick, because a drone may be lurking near there, then all of the management of diversion, stacking planes, handling fuel emergencies and the rest of it instantly falls back onto human controllers dealing with the pilots and all the attendant increased risks of all that.
And cost. I know. Okay, very business. I heard something on the radio yesterday. EasyJet had posted that those 2 days or whatever it was cost them £15 million. That's one airline. That's just an airline. And then you have all the infrastructure around it, the shops, the retail units, the people that sell the fuel.
And disrupted holidays and disappointed families. You can't put a cost on that, can you?
Massive.
That's a lot.
It's massive, just because someone decided to do something with the drone, or maybe not.
Or maybe not, indeed. Yeah. But as with recalls, there was no choice but to take the action that was taken by the authorities, was it? You couldn't just continue on thinking, well, you know, we've heard reports of a drone, but we haven't physically seen it, so we're just going to carry on until we spot one, because you cannot contemplate an aircraft actually making contact with a drone on its final approach.
But you make a really good point about a drone hitting a plane on final approach and the catastrophic events that could happen to it. A little bit risque here coming out and saying this, but a good friend of mine worked for a very well-known airline as an engineer, and he spent his Saturday evenings firing frozen chickens into an engine to simulate what would happen with a bird strike. Now, I've seen some of these drones, and they actually have the mass. Well, a smaller mass than a bird does. So, and I could get massively picked up by an engineer here, but if an aircraft can take a bird strike at speed, surely a drone is something similar. But
yes, agreed. But I think that's going to be a matter for insurance and other things, isn't it? Let alone the brand reputational damage. Because if you know a drone might be there, that's different to knowing. To not knowing and not being able to predict that a swan, a seagull, an eagle, or indeed a frozen chicken could be in the airspace that you're flying your plane through.
This was the point I'm trying to make, and I should have made before I said these, that there is a trade-off with the risk. So somebody will sit around the table at that airport in Sussex and say, we know or we heard reports that there is a drone flying around. Therefore, we open up the risk manual. And there isn't a piece in here for flying drones. Therefore, it's an elevated risk because we don't know how to react to that risk. Therefore, the best course of action to mitigate that risk is to close the airport. If somebody said there are swans over Windsor, evidently, we know there are swans over Windsor, and we know they go flying around, but it doesn't close down Heathrow Airport because there's a book that you can open and say what happens when there's swans flying over Windsor. So it's an unknown, I suppose, is the point I'm trying to make with drones. And maybe there needs to be more money put into understanding the true risk that drones pose to the industry, aviation, and other forms of transport as well. And then being able to give people the tools to be able to make decisions based on the risks presented to them. I
mean, that's a really good point, and one I've not really heard mentioned at all in the media or by the many experts that there are on Twitter that you correctly reference. And from a sort of a contingency planning, business continuity exercising perspective, which is to some degree my background, you know, given that this is now going to be an ongoing challenge, then there does need to be some rehearsed ways in which you go from normal operations at somewhere like Gatwick to getting all those aircraft somewhere else, getting all the repositioning sorted out, because obviously there is no choice but to shut, I would suspect, but there's got to be a better way of handling the consequences to airlines, to people's holidays, to something else, and that's complicated. but not necessarily complex, but sounds, to us at least, as though no one's really given it much thought.
And perhaps it's because it's never been a risk before, isn't it?
Well, I don't know. It's easy to say that, but I've just jotted down on my little pad here, remote-controlled helicopters. Now, actually, remote-controlled helicopters, although probably even more fiendishly difficult to fly and a bit more expensive to buy, perhaps, been around for a long time.
Yep.
No one's really flown them near airports before, but could have done. I know in other parts of the world, insurgency conflicts and so on, groups have used all sorts of remotely controlled boats and aircraft and other things. I just wonder whether we, as usual, haven't quite been imaginative enough thinking about the potential risks. Whether today it's a remote-controlled helicopter or a drone for 30 quid or 3,000, is it that new? Potential risk? I'm not sure it is.
I don't think we need to detail all the risks, though. This is the danger we're getting into.
Oh, yeah.
That
True.
having run companies, if I had to detail every risk that the company was open to and react to every single risk, we wouldn't have been able to open the doors in the morning.
True.
So there is a piece of
Good point.
shot down. There is a piece to say there's risk in everything we do. It's how we react to that risk, and there's a with this particular thing around drones. We really don't know what would happen if something made contact with the fuselage of an aircraft. We just don't. I've seen some quite spectacular stuff on the news on TV where they've flown drones into wings. But I stand to be corrected on this. They're not the wing of a 777 aircraft. They're a wing of a Cessna, and it makes a much sense. I'm not suggesting there's any difference or they're weaker or stronger or anything like that. But no one's actually understood what could or should happen with this.
Yeah.
It's been sensationalized. People don't know how to react to it, and therefore it grew out of control. There was a drone sighting at Heathrow about a week later, if I remember, and I did panic because I was flying out there on my most popular form of transport.
Yes.
But for some reason, it was handled in a completely different manner at Heathrow and had incredibly minimal disruption to flights. There was an evening of some flights got cancelled and diverted, but it did not shut the airfield.
Right.
They were still having to. Maybe that's something to do with twin runway operations or something like that. I don't where you can divert into one runway and ring fence the other runway, but they handled it different. Newark last night seemed to have handled it slightly different to the way it was in Sussex. I'm not saying what was done in Sussex was wrong.
No, we don't know the full details of what they...
It just seems to have been an iterative learning process that maybe people have looked at what happened at Gatwick and then transferred that learning to Heathrow and then again to the...
I think you make a good point. I mean, it's very easy to become to sort of imagine these drones as some sort of sinister, malevolent force, the like of which we've never encountered. But of course, as you're hinting, aircraft are built to withstand hitting really quite large birds. A big goose or a swan or something is a fairly meaty creature. Or lightning strike and other things.
Every year, so
although hitting a drone would be very bad, it's very unlikely to be catastrophic. And maybe this is acquiring a sort of power in our consciousness as travellers, and well, not you because you're fearless, and many of us travellers and airfield operators and others that perhaps it doesn't deserve. But
I'm not suggesting for a second that there's not a risk involved in it.
Yeah.
Or that it wouldn't cause damage. I'm just saying we don't understand that.
Yeah.
And therefore that's causing us to handle the risk in a completely different way than if we understood what the risk was.
Yeah. It's very different, isn't it, to that volcanic dust stuff from a couple of years ago, where actually flying through that, although eventually there were some tests done that showed it wasn't quite as destructive as it was thought, but anyway, flying through that was a very bad idea. It seems like actually continuing to operate, knowing that planes are, capable of handling swans and geese and such like, might be the future, complemented by interesting technologies to deter or deny the space to drones.
But I suppose we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the powers that be shut down the airport for a reason, kept everyone safe.
That's true.
And they did their job, and they move millions and millions and millions of people around every year.
Yep.
And 2 days disruption every 5 years or so is not, in my mind, is a very, very small surprise to Spain. And the complex of that operation, they got a lot of bad press for it. I think if they had to detail every single risk that's out there and have a rule book for it, with a business, they would never fly a single aeroplane. It'd just be grounded. So I think the way they handled it, they got a lot of mocking in the press over it, and maybe they did at Newark last night. But I still think, given what they deal with on a daily basis, it's my
agreed.
in the overall scheme of things, and that people should start actually supporting them.
Yeah, and if there's anything that industry is good at, is learning very quickly, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I'm sure lessons will be learned, and the airlines and airfield operators will have measures in place to, if it happens again, hopefully adapt and be agile so that people still get away on their holidays and honeymoons and such like with minimal disruption.
In this next clip, we hear cyber reporter Eric Geller explain how cyber attacks could affect our supply chains.
It's really a combination of the increasing sophistication of technology and the increasing globalization of production and distribution. I think the best example is in the WannaCry and NotPetya malware attacks that happened. Was it already 2 years ago? That's pretty wild. One of the things that we've seen as a result of some of these malware attacks is when they spread uncontrollably, they can have unintended consequences. And in the case of the NotPetya attack, what you saw was the global shipping giant Maersk was unable to move cargo through some of its facilities because the computers that controlled the distribution of the different cargo containers, and the computers have to talk to the ships when they come into the port. They've got to learn from the ships what they're carrying and where each of those containers is supposed to go. Well, this ransomware was not intended to attack Maersk, but it did. It destroyed their entire computer network basically, and that prevented them in large part from being able to move cargo through some of these facilities. There were massive lines of trucks waiting to get into some of these ports because the computers that were at the entry points were not working. And you actually had companies saying, calling their drivers while the drivers were, in line waiting to get into the port and saying, it's a security threat for your truck to be sitting there where somebody could try to hijack it. Come back to the facility. We're not getting in today. And this was all because of a piece of code that was written somewhere, distributed for some purpose, and then got out of hand and spread uncontrollably, essentially. And there's a fascinating story in Wired, Wired.com, if anybody wants to Google it, to learn basically how Maersk was able to resume operations and how in the interim they had to do a lot of things with pen and paper. It really makes you think about how much we've digitized and how many of those things are in the background of our lives at all times. I'm talking to you right now on a microphone that I bought on Amazon. This microphone was built somewhere. It was designed somewhere. The people who built it were hired by a company. They were given permission to go into a factory and build this thing. Well, what happens if through a cyber threat or another type of threat, you can compromise that supply chain of producers and distributors and essentially infect it and put something in that process that has ripple effects throughout the entire process? And you could imagine the consequences of that, not just for a microphone, but for telecommunications equipment. That's a big conversation that we're having in the United States right now. And I know that many of the other Western countries that are getting ready to build their 5G wireless networks are also having these conversations about what kind of companies do they want to permit to help them build these networks.
I mean, yeah, not long ago, the Apple FaceTime bug popped up, which was a sort of a big problem. Like, just anyone could have listened to any of your conversations.
Yeah, that's another great example. And in that case, it was not a hacker introducing a deliberate vulnerability in the code, at least not as far as we know. It was somebody who people were responsible for designing FaceTime, and they made a mistake, and that was exploitable, and it was exploited. And yeah, that's another great example of the other kind of supply chain vulnerability, which is just a mistake somewhere in the process that anybody can exploit. It's not that somebody has written a special piece of code, but it's that there's a simple vulnerability out there that people can take advantage of as long as they know where it is.
The last clip we'll be hearing tonight is from our very first episode with our director Liam Fessum. In this segment, he explained how Brexit may end up affecting supply chains.
I suppose the biggest, most fundamental way it will affect the supply chain will be through visibility, and it is a very boring and a very overused set of terms. But visibility is the thing that makes the supply chain work. And without visibility, you can't do simple things like see where orders are or track stock coming in and communicate with suppliers and customers alike. So therefore, your business becomes a bit strained. Once something like Brexit, and I suppose if we remove a little bit the emotion from it and call it a geopolitical risk, because that's what this is. Anytime there's some sort of geopolitical risk, and you touched on Trump earlier on today, so along with the American politics or UK, European politics or Russian politics or Asian politics, when there's a geopolitical risk across borders, there's a risk that you can no longer see the information behind that border.
Yeah.
And once you can't see that, you become blind in supply chain. And effectively, you are ordering by fluke. You're hoping that the goods will turn up. You're hoping that your forecasts are correct. You're hoping that the warehouses will be full. So that's the first and most fundamental issue with Brexit or geopolitical risks.
I think you made a really good point about like taking the emotion out of it, because obviously we all people, we've got our thoughts and dreams and ideas of what should be, but you got to really think about the logistics and like the actual facts about it too, because it must be very hard to not know what's going. If you don't know what's going on, then what are you supposed to do? And then I'm sure that gets politicized its own little way, like, oh, you're just saying this because blah 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 blah, or does that make it more frustrating?
I think it's the most frustrating piece about Brexit, say it again, or this is the fact that there is a lot of emotion attached to it. So rather than being maybe I am being a bit too black and white and cold about this, but if you be objective about this, it doesn't matter whether we're in or out, what political party is driving this, you still need food in the cupboards. You still need a supply chain to work, right? So the supply chain is apolitical, it stands by itself, but it gets affected by political decisions. And when these decisions are made, nobody is making any forecasting or attempt at forecasting what may happen. A great example was this week where a large amount of money was spent driving trucks around an airfield in Manston because we think the border is going to clog up. Now, that's, to be quite frank, as much use as a chocolate teapot. That's not solving the problem. All we're doing is saying instead of there being a bottleneck at the port, we're going to move the bottleneck to a disused airfield in North Kent. And we could effectively move it up towards the Midlands if we want to, where a lot of the stuff's end destination when they turn the trucks around. It's not dealing with the bottleneck. You're just moving it into some other area and making it someone else's problem. So we seem hell bent on that. And again, we're 48 days away from a potential leaving the European Union, and we're still trying to drive trucks around and work out what the bloody hell we're going to do with the queue. So that doesn't make sense to me. So, and if we take it if we think about it from a supply chain, some of the supply chains worked in, especially some of the food ones, we could be ordering a month to 3 months ahead for stock that's coming in. I don't know how any of the supply chains at the moment in the UK are ordering past, when are we supposed to be leaving? Is it March?
Yeah, March.
Yeah, so past March. So the next quarter 2 forecast. How anyone is doing a quarter 2 forecast in business right now is beyond me, and I take my hat off to them, because how can you possibly predict what the lead time of a lettuce from Spain to England is going to be come March? You can't. It's all subjective. That's the most frustrating piece.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. As always, we want to thank both the University of Northampton's List Institute and Societal for helping create this podcast. You can find us on Twitter at societal_, or on Facebook and LinkedIn by searching Societal CIC. To find out more about us via our website, simply head to www.societal.org.uk. Thank you for listening. We'll be back soon.